And what they said was, look, there's this new book, Becoming a Post-Industrial Society, Daniel Bell. Very impressive. We'd like you to have a look at this. And, they knew I was someone who could look critically at stuff, and so that's what I did. And I really believed Daniel Bell.
Oh, really? To start with?
I really believed it, and what I thought I was going to do was take an incomplete empirical story and turn it into a more complete empirical story. Daniel Bell had talked about occupational employment, and he talked about industrial employment, and he'd shown that occupations were going to service occupations, industries are going to service industries, and then very simply he had this thing from the 19th century German economist Friedrich Engels, which said that in those times it was manufacturing industry, as societies get richer, households spend less, a smaller proportion on primary produce, food, and a larger on manufactured consumption. And so that Engels' law is this shift from primary to manufacturing consumption. And similarly, so Bell said, and all the statistics when you looked at them showed you, as richer families still spent more on services than they did on manufacturing. So you didn't have technical change in service production. Barber was the issue, and you always had the barber and the barber. So on one hand, you had no productivity growth in services, was the assumption, and you had this huge productivity growth in manufacturing. But thank God, to save us all, was this Engels' law transition to consuming more services.
Right. And why did that save us all? Why was it a good thing?
Well, because what it meant was that as labour was displaced from manufacturing industry, it could be absorbed into services in a straightforward and simple way. And I believed this. That was the thesis. I believed this, and I thought, okay, well, what's missing here is actually looking at what households spend their money on.
So he hadn't done that?
He hadn't done that. He'd merely taken from the economists who looked cross-sectionally at, a survey, and you find that more and more people can that the richer the household is, the larger the proportion of its expenditure goes on services, straightforwardly. And I never disproved that there's always that positive association of self-servicing and of mechanisation and subsequently automation.
Right.
That automation didn't just mean reduction, mechanisation, automation didn't just mean the reduction in labour required for a given output, but also a change in the shape of the labour so you needed more managers, more designers, more programmers, more technical people to actually set up the mechanized production.
Yes.
So it's not just reduced numbers, but it was more, and this was the confusion, more service workers.
Yeah.
So what we found was this growth in things that I called producer services. So it was a growth in service activity, but it's service activity for other enterprises, not service activity that households were buying themselves. And this was the central error in the Bell thesis. He'd said we've got growth in service industries, growth in service occupations. These imply growth in consumption of services. No, it did not. It meant something different. It meant this is the technicization of the more and more involvement of technology in material production.
His conclusion that was wrong.
So it was his conclusion that service driven by final service consumption would grow. That was what was wrong. And in fact, one of the nicest illustrations of this was shopping.
Yeah.
Where you had this move from a fully serviced, or for at least a partially serviced model. So I in the 1950s, in my caricature, you go to the corner shop, you put your head round, you say, "Hello, Mr. Jones, could I have the usual?" And then you walk on, and Mr. Jones says, "Oh yes, it's figured that, put it in the box, give it to Johnny, who puts it on his bicycle and cycles it round, and you pick it up." Okay, 1950s, growth of supermarkets and change in the transport system. Instead of walking to your corner shop, you get in your car, you drive to the car park of your supermarket, you walk to the supermarket, you walk up and down the lines doing that job that Mr. Jones used to do. You queue, you pay, you take, so a huge decline in the number of final service workers, people providing those retail services, and an increase, presumably, of activity outside the economy of people doing those transport and warehousing functions, where the supermarkets were like wholesale warehouses previously.
And had anyone seen this before?
I was probably the first to spot this systematic. I was certainly the first to write up this